Okay, yeah. So welcome everyone. Thanks for the kind introduction, Milan. Yeah, today I'm gonna talk about social limits to growth, or why growth is never going to keep its promises. Okay. Yeah, that's the outline for the lecture today. First, I'm going to talk about growth as a societal phenomenon. That's going to be the whole, like the perspective I'm going to take in this whole lecture. Yeah, I'm just make that clear. Then I'm going to talk about the current importance of economic growth in social institutions. On different, and then on different, we'll talk about different lines of critique. Yeah, against that, against economic growth. And then I will kind of start to talk about a short history of economic growth. And finally, I will introduce alternatives to GDP and alternative policies. Okay. So, portraying economic growth as a societal phenomenon means that growth is something which is, or like the idea of growth is something which has to be seen in the context, in a certain time and space context, which also results from a historical process. We will talk later about this process. Recently, it became problematic because of environmental limits, yeah, as you have probably heard last time, but also because of social limits. And I defined social limits as the impossibility of growth to fulfill its promises, so that the society as a whole is kind of hunting a ghost. But the good thing is, growth is not without alternative. There are other possibilities of structuring society and the economy. Okay, so let's talk about the importance of growth today. So as you can see in all those kind of newspaper headlines I just picked, economic growth is used to evaluate all kind of different historical events. For instance, the fight against the Hamas or different policies, and it is the most important policy goal. Accordingly, it also figures in the SDGs. Here, SDG number 8 is decent work and economic growth, and is also adapted to climate change recently in the Green New Deal, which is described by Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, as new growth strategy. Common to all those very different discourses are 4 main narratives, which are described by Schmelzer as growth paradigm. This is namely, first, growth, GDP adequately measures economic activity. Growth is a panacea for changing socioeconomic challenges. Growth is a necessary mean to achieve the most essential societal goals, such as progress, well-being, or national power. And growth is essentially unlimited, provided the correct governmental and intergovernmental policies are pursued. Okay. Those narratives, as I already said, are characteristic for the growth paradigm. Schmelzer uses thereby the notion of paradigm introduced by Kuhn and later adapted from Peter Hall to the policy or political realm. And they define paradigm as unquestioned beliefs that guide thinking and action and can not or are not really reflected. And it is reflected in societal institutions and the individual mindset. And the thing is that within that growth paradigm, growth is like the growth narrative is adapted to different socioeconomic challenges, as for instance, climate change. And then it's, for example, green growth, or to evade poverty, it is adapted to inclusive growth. Yeah, and also at an institutional level, growth is kind of very important, as it's reflected in the growth state. The growth state basically is dependent on economic expansion, hence economic growth, and focuses on solving problems like inequality, poverty, climate change through growth. Thus, growth is the most important priority in national policy making. And is also used to measure the success or failure of government policies. So this applies to most modern states, as they are all dependent on growth in the one or other way. For example, in their pension systems, or when they take debt, like public debt, then they're also dependent on growth, and all modern states are like indebted. Yeah. And the appeal of growth is closely associated, or actually derives from the simple equation: growth is progress, is welfare, is well-being. So thereby, growth is seen as proxy for progress and employment, and also is said to lead to welfare, a higher standard of living, and subjective well-being through material provision. Thus, the ultimative promise of growth is that in the future there will be a higher subjective well-being for everyone in the world, and poverty will be evaded. So yeah, so probably it's the point kind of to think about what actually is growth. And growth is nothing else than the annual GDP increase, which is the gross domestic product increase, which is then the total monetary value of goods and services produced in a specific year in a specific country. If you think about it, well, at least for me, it's quite weird that all those kind of good things should come from growth when it's just the increased monetary value of goods and services. And I guess I'm not the only person who thought it would be weird, because a lot of other people already formulated different lines of critique against economic growth. And I will briefly introduce them now. Okay, so I kind of picked 4 exemplary lines of critique here. I guess there are many more. Yeah, and I will not talk about ecological or environmental limits to growth, because you've heard of that last time. So I will only talk about the 3 others. And the first 2 that for me very closely related to those social limits of growth. So yeah, I decided to talk to them about them too. Okay. So the first line of critique is that the focus on growth serves particular interests. First, it is said to prevent the discourse about redistribution by claiming that economic growth will eventually trickle down and benefit the poor too. And second, it is used to legitimize liberalization and deregulation policy, as economic growth, as free markets are said to work best and thus lead to the most economic growth. Yeah. And then the second line of critique is that GDP is mismeasuring our lives, which basically already was introduced by Simon Kasnet, one of the founding fathers of GDP, who claimed that GDP is not measuring welfare, but only the value of production from a business side, from a business point of view, which does not take into account the redistribution or necessity of the goods. Moreover, it was often criticized that only a single figure would be used, and then feminist economists have always criticized that the reproductive sector would be left out. Yeah, and more recently also the whole socioeconomic and environmental consequences that are not considered are increasingly criticized. Okay, so now we'll talk about social limits to growth. So maybe first we will recap the definition. The definition was kind of the fact that growth will not fulfill its promises. And yeah, then there I've kind of formulated 4 different lines or 4 different limits of growth. First, material satisfaction. Second, positional goods. Third, economic inequality. And fourth, global and intergenerational justice. Okay, so growth for what? The first is the material, is the claim that after basic material needs are satisfied, additional growth and hence additional income does not lead to a higher subjective well-being, but for that more time would be required. Though, yeah, for that would be more time would be required. Easterline, an economist, already found something very similar in 1974. He claimed he had the same insight, and moreover, he claimed that subjective well-being would only improve if the relative income of people increases, and not like the absolute. So if the income compared to others would increase. This is closely related to the second social limit of growth, namely positional goods. Already in 1976, he is actually the one of the first scholars who worked on social limits and growth. He published this book in 1976. And he claimed that above a certain material well-being, again, a rising proportion of income would be used for positional goods. What are positional goods? Positional goods are goods that indicate an individual's position in society. They depend on the relative income of persons, and they're necessarily scarce. If they're not scarce, they will not be used for distinction. The claim now is that economic growth cannot satisfy the demand for positional goods because if the lower classes will increase in income, then the dreams or positional goods will shift, and other goods will be used for distinction. Thus, essentially, economic growth is essentially senseless from the perspective of positional goods. So, nevertheless, it also has a negative side effect because it has huge. The struggle for distinction has huge social costs. Namely, at an individual level, free time is getting more costly, and people are trying to get more income that can be used for distinction. That leads to commodification of social relationships, and at a whole societal level, a lot of income is actually wasted because people buy stuff they wouldn't really need, or just spend a lot of money on brands, and that money could be spent for public infrastructure or other things which would benefit the whole society. here you can see here in the graph, you can see how the relation of private capital and public capital, you can see in like the last year, it's decreasing while private capital is increasing. Okay, and the next one is like the next kind of chapter is inequality. I have more kind of sub feeds of it. Okay, the first one is Piketty claims in his famous book, The Capital in the 21st Century, that inequality is inherent to capitalism. Many claim that inequality is reduced by economic growth, but in fact, it's not a question of whether there is growth or not, but whether there is redistribution or not. So the distribution of the economic growth, in fact, is a question of politics. And right now it is, so since actually the neoliberal era in the 1970s, that economic interests hinder extensive redistribution, and thus growth does not benefit like the poorest, but over proportionally benefit the rich. Moreover, the recent technological change also multiplies the investment opportunities for capital, so that capital income even increases even more, and thus the rich are getting richer even more. The problem with that is that economic inequality causes social and political problems, as for instance health problems or right-wing populism, as said by Chantal Mouffe. Okay, and here I have like a graph where you can see the increasing numbers of billionaires recently. You can see like in the last 20 years, it was like, it went up a lot. And here you can see that, yeah, the interdependence of health and social problems and income inequality. Okay, so that's also another kind of subtopic of the problem of inequality. It is that it's kind of like a Keynesian argument that without growth there's no demand, and demand is determined by the propensity to consume, as you will probably all have learned in your microeconomic class. And those propensities to consume are distributed highly unequal among different income classes. The higher the income class, the lower the propensity to consume, the higher the propensity to save. Thus, to like keep growing, people need to, people like lower classes are actually starting to take debt. This is also, for example, necessary for student loans in America, but also for consuming debts, housing markets, bubbles. And this eventually leads to the fact that capital is concentrated in the financial sector, and thus, which is way more crisis prone, and that debt also reinforces power relations and inequality. Okay, here you can see the development of debt, private debt in GDP. Yeah, without big surprise, Germany's far lower than the US, but also quite high. China is super high. I was quite surprised about that fact. And you can also see that with crisis, the debt ratio drops significantly. Okay. This last problem associated with inequality is the problem of globalization. So basically the idea is that with globalization, competitive pressures increase, and the states have to act or start to act as competition state to attract economic growth within their own borders by attracting foreign direct investment and similar. And in this context, the eco-imperial tensions to externalize ecological costs of production increase as everyone seeks to maximize growth, and thus costs are not very attractive. Moreover, resource competition is increased at global level, which eventually also leads to wars, as for example the Gulf War, and so in the end, actually, global competition reinforces and reproduces inequality, most significantly between the global north and the global south. This, for example, it leads to deindustrialization of the global south, so that extractivism of natural resources becomes a necessary condition to make a living, while the global north can that way also externalize its environmental costs. So those tendencies are as well mutually reinforcing. Okay, and now I will briefly talk about, sorry. Okay, here now you have another graph on the GDP per capita distribution, where you can see that it's just that countries which have been way more up in the 50s already are now like really, really high, while countries who have been lower are now not so high too. Yeah, so you can just see that economic growth tends, or there are like past dependencies, national past dependencies, and it's not like that growth would benefit everyone the same at an international level, but tends to benefit those countries who have already been wealthier before more. Okay, now we'll turn to the question of justice. So basically, yeah, first I will talk about global justice, and so and start with the claim that of the imperial mode of living introduced by Ulrich Brandt and Markus Wissen, to be honest, and they make the argument that economic growth, not that the imperial mode of, like the wealth in the global north is based on this imperial mode of living, which basically means that the patterns of productions rely on global labor power, resources, and things. And so it is basically that the wealth of the north relies on kind of like on those patterns, which and moreover that globalization implies a deepening and extension of those patterns to other income classes, like for example the global middle class, while others have to take the burden, for example lower classes, and this leads to a globally unequal appropriation of nature. So on the one hand, on the consumption side, as richer classes tend to consume more and thus also use more natural resources. And also on the production side, as the global north tends to secure access to critical resources, as for example, you could see in those Gulf Wars where it was the question who could access oil. Moreover, the recent crisis of overaccumulation leads to a financialization of agriculture, soil, and infrastructure, which increases inequality as it threatens it threatens the poorest. And eventually, as extractivism also leads to social conflict in the global south, concerning mining, fossil fuels, hydropower, and affects most indigenous and peasant communities. So yeah, you could say that the costs of globalization are distributed highly unequal. And last but not least, I want to make the intergenerational justice or injustice argument that is made a lot by the climate movement, I guess, and especially Fridays for Futures, which is basically the claim that the growth of today brings social and environmental costs for future generations, as they have to deal with the consequences. Climate economists tend to simply discount these costs, as they assume that future generations will be richer, and therefore they will have less problems to deal with those challenges. Though recently the German and Australian Constitutional Court decided that the current government policy is not sufficient to face climate change, and I would completely support that claim and say that we need way more ambitious strategies and goals for intergenerational justice. Okay, so after the diagnosis, for me it was kind of like the question, okay, what to do now? And kind of the good news about that is that economic growth is not so old, and that there's nothing natural about it, as I already claimed before. Okay, so now I want to give like a short, brief history on how economic growth became that important, and yeah, then I'm going to talk about the alternatives. Okay, so the short history of growth. Well, before 1820, it was actually no growth before the Industrial Revolution. So you can already see that economic growth is very closely related to the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, as capitalist societies depend on capital accumulation. However, at the political scale, it only gained importance after the Second World War. And that was because, here you can, here I have like a few numbers for you on growth rates. You can see in the beginning, growth was actually only only an effect of population growth. It wasn't so much of economic growth, like without population growth. But then later on, you can see the population growth was like 1.8%, and economic growth suddenly was like 4.6%. So it really took off after the Second World War. And that was because it had like a huge appeal. It was very useful in European reconstruction because it turned political conflicts over distribution into technical questions of increasing GDP. As I already indicated, growth kind of like makes it redundant to talk about distribution. And that is just politically very, very attractive. And then it also had a technocratic appeal, which kind of could be contrasted in a very good way to the irrational state management in the 30s, associated with the Second World War. So yeah, and therefore it became soon a major policy objective and very important in Keynesianism. It became actually a foundation of national power in that time. Yeah. In the 60s, then the narrative of unlimited growth arose, and soon there were some critics from actually the OECD who said that growth couldn't go on forever, and that it's like kind of senseless. And then it was like re-articulated as a qualitative growth to kind of take into account that there are kind of negative side effects, and then you would have to have qualitative growth to like, it's not okay to only have quantitative growth, it also has to be like the good growth. And yeah, so already in 1972, Daly diagnosed the growth paradigm, which was described as the idea of unlimited growth. Then in the 70s, with the neoliberal era, there was like this neoliberal shift, and the growth paradigm, which was like a Keynesian thing, actually was flexible enough to adapt to this neoliberal era. And as it was re-articulated as trickle-down argument. So the idea that economic growth will benefit the poorest, as it just benefits the whole economy. And and moreover, in this context, economic growth became the most important social policy, which we kind of can still see today when politics talk about the importance of people being employed and saying, okay, we need, everybody needs to get a job, and we need growth and employment and stuff like that. So it's still there, this idea. And yeah, Wendy Brown then claims that the state is radically economized, which basically means that it is evaluated by its ability to accumulate capital and by its ability to facilitate growth, which is already then closely associated to that what I described before as growth state. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about alternative policies. So what to do now? Okay, so first, what to do, challenge the growth paradigm. Yeah, first, don't trust green growth because, as I already said, there are like multiple ways of, or adaptations, or adaptations of how growth should solve different kind of problems, but eventually they're nothing else than what Schmelzer in his for narratives introduced, and they're thus part of this growth paradigm. Yeah, and are nothing new to solve problems, but just a re-articulation. Yeah, then what those social limits I just introduced can be used to criticize the dominant narratives of the growth paradigm. And I actually found it I was thinking about it like earlier, and I found it quite appealing to use social limits to growth rather than those ecological limits to growth, because or additional to it, because I found it sometimes very, very exhausting to fight with people of whether technology is gonna be like, technological change is gonna be fast enough or not. Yeah. And last but not least, introduce alternatives. So I'm going to introduce alternatives now. First, I'm going to introduce alternative indicators. So what is quite broadly discussed are those like happiness or quality of life indexes. There are very many, very different. For example, there's like this very, very famous Gallup survey, which is made by a like marketing firm, and they are asking managers, as far as I know. So and then there are like all those like different rankings. For example, there's like this quality of life ranking from Insitute, where they also ask managers about it. But there are also things like happiness indicators. For example, very a very well-known example is Bhutan in this regard, but also Denmark. Denmark is one of the happiest countries apparently in the world, though Cabanas and Illouz claim that this is not without problems, as happiness can somehow turn into an imperative, and so that so that people kind of feel the obligation to say that they're happy, because in neoliberalism, there's kind of the idea that you're kind of responsible for being happy and having a good life. And if you're not, it's not the fault of the system, but your own fault. And so that's the reason why these two critical scholars kind of claim that it's not the best idea to just use subjective measures, but it is also necessary to use material indicators to know how distribution of wealth is facilitated, how, yeah, different things, how the environment is doing. Okay, and that's the reason why I kind of I really see this argument, and that's the reason why I kind of would stick more with multidimensional measures. There's, for example, the Sustainable Development Index introduced by Hickel in 2020. He basically takes the Human Development Index, which is a quite common thing, but that doesn't account for environmental problems or environmental costs, which are kind of produced by human development, and he says that they have to be taken into account, and yeah, thus actualizes that, and this is this Human Development Index. And another one is actually put forward by the Enquete Kommission, a Enquete Commission from the Deutsche Bundestag, which I found quite interesting. And that's the reason why I decided to introduce it a bit deeper. So basically, sorry for all English speakers. So basically, there are like three main kind of main fields. So material well-being, social participation, and environmental ecology. Okay, so first, like the GDP, okay, GDP per capita, okay, but then they also have here the distribution and government debt. Then they have employment quote, education, quality of life, expectation of life, and freedom. And here they have like emissions, NO, and biodiversity. Like when you look at those indicators like more precise, some of them are pretty weird. For example, I would not include government debt. I probably wouldn't include labor or employment rates. And you could also question why or what kind of indicator this freedom thing here is, or whether it is a good indicator for biodiversity to look at birds, because it's like the National Bird Index. But nevertheless, I found it quite, I found it a quite good example, and there are not so many concrete examples. That's the reason why I picked it, of different, like an indicator with like different dimensions, where very, different dimensions are taken into account, so that there's not like a single number to judge the whole kind of state of a country. And the second thing I found quite good about it is that it appears to me rather simple in terms of that it would be possible to actually just do every year or every once in a while. Yeah. Okay. And now I will finally talk about alternative policies. Policies I would kind of appreciate. So first, redistribute, not growth, as we've already kind of talked about. What happens to the economic growth is a question of politics, and I guess a lot of people argue that you could also redistribute without growing, and that there is actually enough capital, income, that wealth that could be redistributed at global and international level to kind of facilitate a good life for all without growing, and thus without negative ecological impacts. And second, democratize the economy. For me, that's closely related to the first alternative policy, because I think it would be a necessary step to do to kind of legitimize such policies. And then, of course, work less, because working does actually lead to environmental problems, because it produces treibhausgas emissions. And yeah, and then last but not least, local self-sufficiency. So trying to localize production and consumption through, for example, solavis, or repair centers. Yeah. Okay. That actually was everything from my side. Thanks for your attention. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. And here is my literature if you're interested.